Hello, everyone. Welcome to Communicating Migration for Impact panel. My name is Marzia Nezakat, and I'm the Senior Manager of CMS. So it's my pleasure to introduce Winnie Chironga from the Affiliation of Multicultural Societies and Service Agencies of BC, AMSSA, who will be moderating this session. Winnie is the Director of Equity at AMSSA, where she leads a broad equity, anti-racism, and inclusion portfolio. Her work includes advancing Indigenous truth and decolonization initiatives under the guidance of AMSSA's Indigenous Advisory Council, supporting sector-wide capacity building and strengthening organizational practices that promote belonging, accountability, and systems change across British Columbia's settlement sector. Winnie brings a multidisciplinary background in law, business, and community development, alongside lived experience as an immigrant woman of color. Her leadership focuses on bridging community-based knowledge with institutional systems, supporting culturally grounded approaches to mentorship and leadership development, and creating spaces where equity-deserving communities can thrive without having to diminish their identities. Over to you, Winnie.
Thank you so much, Mazie, and good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you today. And before I begin, I always love to ground myself. I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I offer that not only as protocol, but reflection, reminder, and acknowledgement that all conversations about migration, such as the one we're about to have, both past and present, are happening on lands with much longer and richer stories than we could ever tell. So with that, I'll begin. We know that migration is everywhere right now. It's in headlines, it's in public policy, it's in policy debates, social media, and if your family is anything like mine, it's also creeped into the dinner table conversations. We know that if we're being honest, the quality of those conversations is feeling increasingly fragile and quite fragmented. What we're seeing is more polarization, more simplification, and quite sadly, less humanity. And at the same time, those of us who are working within policy, within research, and even within community, we know all too well that migration is anything but simple. It's layered, it's relational, and it's deeply human. And yet, we're seeing a gap. There's a gap between what we now know from data and research and what actually gets to reach policymakers, to reach the community, and even the larger public. Too often, migration stories are being reduced to numbers, or worse, they're framed as crisis. And instead of being actually understood for what they are, that they are part of systems, they're part of histories, and they are part of our lived realities. So today, with this panel, we're asking a different set of questions altogether. We're hoping to understand, how do we communicate migration in ways that, yes, may still be rigorous, but are still felt? What kinds of storytelling are actually shifting those narratives rather than just reinforcing them? And what does it take, if we look at ethical considerations, relationally, practically, to do this well? This panel today brings together 4 incredible scholars who are working across very different modes of storytelling. We'll hear about theater and performance, comics and visual narrative, creative nonfiction, and investigative journalism. These approaches are challenging the idea that academic impact only looks like journal articles or policy briefs. Instead, they're inviting us to think about communication as relational, as collaborative, shaped rather by the audiences, their power, and their responsibility. At AMSSA, we work closely with immigrant and refugee-serving organizations, so we're acutely aware that migration narratives matter. They shape public opinion, funding decisions, policy choices, but really most importantly, they shape our everyday sense of belonging and safety. And we know that storytelling is never neutral. It can open space for understanding on one breath, but in the other, it can also still quietly legitimize exclusion. This panel today is not about finding that one perfect way of translating research. It's actually about learning from their experimentation, what has been working, what failed, what traveled, and what didn't. It's also really about honest reflection on collaboration, on ethics, and on the limits of our own authority as storytellers and scholars. So with that, I'm really honored to introduce our panelists, each who are bringing a powerful and distinct lens to this work. I'll start with Dr. Geraldine Pratt right at the end. She's a professor of geography whose work sits at the intersection of migration, labor, and care. And what I found especially powerful about her work is that it moves beyond the traditional academic spaces into performance, into film, and collaborative storytelling. Her work reminds us that research just doesn't live on paper. It can live in our bodies, in spaces, and even in relationships. She continues collaborative research with migrant organizations on temporary foreign worker programs, alongside projects on aging and changing geographies of care and housing and justice in the context of climate change. Dr. Elizabeth Nijdam, Biz brings a really unique lens through comics, games, and visual storytelling. Her work explores how complex histories and difficult truths can still be communicated in ways that are accessible without being simplified. She's also deeply engaged in community and Indigenous collaborations, which bring an important layer of responsibility and care to our conversation today. She's established the UBC Comic Studies Cluster back in 2023 and directs the UBC Pop Culture Cluster and serves on the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Forum. Dr. Kamal Al-Solaylee. Kamal is a professor and director at the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media, and an award-winning author whose work blends personal narrative with global analysis. His writing travels across countries, across identities, and challenges us to think about belonging, about race, and return in ways that feel both intimate and political. His nonfiction blends geopolitics, personal narrative, and field reporting from more than 20 countries. He's a two-time National Magazine Award nominee, winning gold in 2019, and has recently written and produced documentaries for CBC's Ideas. Last, but certainly not least, Dr. Peter Klein. Peter is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and founder of the Global Reporting Center. His work and the work of his students has reached global audiences through major media platforms. He leads the Global Reporting Program, an international investigative journalism course that has partnered with outlets including the New York Times, Toronto Star, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera. What stands out is his commitment to investigative storytelling that doesn't just inform, but actually hold systems accountable. So with that, we'll begin with some brief opening reflections from each of our panelists. You have about 7 minutes each before we then move to the moderated discussion, and then we'll lead off with the time for audience questions. And during this time, we encourage you to think about how these ideas are connecting with your own work. Whether you're a researcher, a practitioner, a student, someone who's currently going through the migration systems firsthand, think about the interaction with where you are. And so we'll begin by grounding ourselves in their work. Maybe I'll invite you, Geraldine, to start. You can share a bit about your work, how your approach communicating migration has been, and what has drawn you to this space right now.
Thank you. This is going to help by holding the mic, and I'm going to stay fairly close to the text because we have 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to talk about a theater project that emerged out of a long-term relationship with the Philippine Women's Center, and that research relationship began a long time ago in 1994. As a migrant organization, grassroots migrant organization, they wanted to work with a researcher to document the lives of Filipino women and their families who were coming to Canada under a temporary work visa program that at that point was called the Live-in Caregiver Program. So we just kept working together because they had more things that they wanted to document about their community. And so over the years, we, on the right is our first project in the basement of the what was the Philippine Center at that time. So we published academic papers, we held press conferences, published public-facing reports, presented at conferences where researchers, academics, policymakers, government service organizations, activist organizations commingled, and I would say with very little effect. So when we were approached in 2007 by theater artists who wanted to work with us to create a testimonial play from our archive of interviews, we really leapt at the chance. Our play, oops, that's what I have to do. Oops. Our play, Nanay, a testimonial play, was first performed in Vancouver at the Push International, at the Push Festival in 2009, and subsequently it traveled to Berlin, Manila twice, Whitehorse, Winnipeg, among other places. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the form because I think it's important for thinking about the specificity of how we were using theater as a mode of research dissemination and then eventually as a mode of research creation, which is a little different. So we literally created the play out of our edited research interviews. It was a site-specific play, which means that it was created in relation to a specific place, which was in Vancouver at Chapel Arts in the downtown east side, and it was just across the street or across next block across Oppenheimer Park from the Calian Center, the home of the Philippine Women's Center. We broke the audience into the audience of 60 into groups of 15, and it was kind of an elaborate setup where we guided these groups of 15 each through different rooms to hear stories at very close quarters. So they heard stories from a woman who had left her children in the Philippines to work in Vancouver as a domestic work. They heard from a care worker about her very exploitative employment experiences. They heard a story of a child who had been reunited with her mother in Vancouver after a very long period of family separation. And we also created testimonial scenes from interviews that I'd done with employers, in part to tell stories of privilege, and that would be the one in the bathrobes, but also to tell the story of how difficult it is to find high-quality childcare, affordable childcare in Canada without relying on migrant labor. And these two women tell the stories of struggling to do so. And I think the latter is really important to create the ground for a really serious dialogue among people who are certainly differently, but in some sense mutually implicated in a really terrible situation in which care is fundamentally undervalued and relying on migrant labor becomes a solution. And in one case, one of the women turned in the end to hiring a domestic worker. The other left her job, her employment, because she just couldn't find adequate care. At the end of the play, the audience was brought together to have a discussion, and the talk back on went on for an hour. The Philippine Women's Center ensured that there were at least 8 women and or their children who'd come to Canada through the Live-in Caregiver program in the audience. And when Canadians gave us feedback on the play, it was that experience of traveling in such small groups with Filipino domestic workers and their children to hear stories in a really intimate space that made the biggest impression, perhaps more than the play itself. As one audience member put it, as someone, I quote, as someone without direct experience of the program, being able to see it with people who had direct experience, I found it extremely moving. But equally, at a forum we held with the Filipino community associated with the Philippine Women's Center after the play had closed, a Filipino-Canadian activist, a father of two young children, spoke of being surprised at how moved he was by the testimony of the Canadian employers. So to quote, "I was surprised to like parts that I didn't think I'd like. In particular, the two women in the kitchen. I don't know why it resonated so much, but I think it was really seeing the Canadian issues collide with the Filipino community issues as two mothers talked about their difficulty finding childcare. My reaction was really surprising to me." The play and talkback also created a container for some pretty serious political discussions and debate. In one talkback, for instance, a white employer asked very earnestly at the beginning of the talkback how she could be a better employer. "Please tell me how I could be a better employer." And she was told pretty directly by members of the Philippine Women's Center that really wasn't the issue. But by the end of the talkback, that same very liberal, well-meaning employer came to the conclusion, I'm using her words, the structure of the thing sucks and structural change is required. So I suppose what I can offer is that theater can be a way to force certainly an effective, affective engagement, but also a very critical dialogue across difference. I could talk about the travels of the play. I love talking about the travels of the play and the two that I've done subsequently, but I won't do that. But what I want to leave you with is that, so I'll leave you with that, is that the use of theater doesn't have to be as produced as Nanai was. We've presented Nanai here, two images, as rehearsed script readings at community centers. The one on the left is Whitehorse, at theater festivals, the right, Winnipeg, and at academic conferences in the UK and Canada. So I would say that you can experiment. For the students in the room, you can experiment by creating monologues from your richest interviews. You can start small, just see where it goes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I don't have slides, so I'm just going to talk. I am an academic, I'm a journalist, and I'm a nonfiction book author. On good days, these three identities cohere and work seamlessly. But there are other times when they're not just at odds, but at war, especially when I'm teaching about reporting or writing on migration as a story. My story, for I am an immigrant. I came here to Canada 30 years ago, exactly this month in April 1996, which was also the content or the subject of my first nonfiction book, a personal memoir. But also the stories of people and communities all over the world. In Hong Kong, domestic workers from the Philippines and Indonesia, Sri Lankan and Nepalese construction workers in Qatar, undocumented Hispanic migrants in Texas, who have invited me into their lives and their homes in my second and third books and in my journalism in general. So, being the journalist that I am, I'm going to put aside the times when the academic reporter and book author vibe and focus on the internal and ethical conflicts inherent in writing for a general audience. Anyone who has filled a SHIRK application recently knows that knowledge mobilization is a buzzword, is a buzz phrase in the academy. But in discussing its impact, I want to take a close look at its perils and its promise. And of course, I'm going to focus on the perils as well. At the heart of reaching a wider audience is the idea of releasing, quote unquote, knowledge that some argue has been trapped in research papers, theses, conference proceedings, and communicating it to a general audience. It is how I built my career as someone who started as an academic, I have a PhD in Victorian literature, but became a journalist with a knack for writing to a general reading public. I am the first to admit that my relationship to the work that many of you in the room produce is opportunistic. Actually, earlier draft, they had the word vampiric as well. They have a opportunistic relationship to the work of academics, especially in area where I write about the most, migration and race. I am grateful for the detailed studies, the peer-reviewed research, the deep dives academics produce, while knowing very well that I neither have the time nor necessarily the specialist training to reproduce it. My talent is to translate it, reshape it by placing it in the more accessible genre of nonfiction, or narrative nonfiction especially. The term nonfiction is a weird hybrid that avails itself to truth as much as it does to the traditions of fiction, character, storytelling, scene, story arc. I'll return to narrative in a few seconds. But first, I want to explore the inherent risk of misunderstanding or oversimplifying complex scholarly research. I like to think I've done a good job of avoiding that, but ultimately my loyalty as a journalist and book author is not to the research necessarily, but to the imperatives of narrative, or the ability to weave responsibly between story and context, people and policies, lived experience and theory. If I must err, I'm not saying that I do that habitually, I err in favor of story. Which brings me to narrative, something that Winnie has already touched on, but I'm just going to kind of add a little bit from my experience. Narrative is an incredibly seductive and human experience. Ever since we were babies, our parents or elders or caregivers in our communities told us stories to send us to sleep, to scare us into obedience, or just to entertain us. Narrative is seductive, but it's also deceptive. Exactly what Winnie was saying about how it can be manipulated. It can work for us and against us. I urge you to read Maria Konikova's book, The Confidence Game, Why We Fall for It Every Time. It's one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books, and it's about how scam artists sort of get away with murder. And if you're a scam artist, if anyone has that career ambition, and I hope not, you're as good as the stories you fabricate about who you are and what you plan to do. More alarmingly, far-right and fascist groups have for too long shaped the migration debate because they've been really good at creating simple but effective narratives. Somalis eat cats. Hispanics bring drugs and crime. Muslims try to install Sharia law through back channels. The history of anti-Semitism is one long case in point. I think of and struggle with both the risk of oversimplification and the seduction of story in the work I do. As you explore communicating your migration research for impact, consider what is gained, but what's also lost in the push for knowledge mobilization. Off the record, I think you are the better position to tell those stories than journalists, just kind of availing themselves to the research you do. But of course, I'm not going to say that in writing. I'm sure we'll get into it in the discussion, but there are ways to install checks and balances and to follow an ethically responsible and inclusive approach to telling other people's stories as you transition from an academic to general audience. The process is complex, but to end on a positive note for a change, it does have a great promise. And anyone who wants to talk to me about creative nonfiction after this panel, please come and say hello. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate coming after you because I'm about to talk about narrative and knowledge mobilization. So my name is Biz Nijdam, and I need this thing. I'm here to talk to you about comics. Not these comics. Come on, not these comics, but actually kind of these comics. For those of you, so I'm a comic scholar, and the work that I do is largely in popular media, but my research expertise is grounded in comics and graphic novels. And even Superman is a story of a refugee. So if we want to think about the relationship between migration studies and comics, which is something I do a lot, this is how I open most of my talks. But the comics that I want to talk to you about today are less grounded in superhero narratives. And I want to speak to you a little bit about, why is it skipping? There we go. An entire genre of comics and cartooning that have emerged since largely 2015, though they date back previous to that, that earnestly try to grapple with the issues of migration, forced migration in particular. They emerge in dialogue with a genre of comics and cartooning called graphic journalism, which was largely pioneered by Joe Sacco and continues on today to tell nonfiction stories through the lens of a cartoonist. Today, even we're seeing another genre of migration cartoons and comics coming out, and this is one that speaks to my daughter, my 10-year-old daughter, really well. So there's a lot of YA graphic novels that are being integrated into school curriculums in order to educate on migration stories. And here's a quick note about another genre, specifically looking at the certain content around immigration from Vietnam. And so there's several comic books that are working specifically with these themes. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a landscape of what it looks like when we're talking about comics and cartooning in discourses of migration. My research, before I get to what I want to talk about, which is narrative and knowledge mobilization, looks at the way in which comics and cartoons tell these stories differently, how they draw upon the affordances of comics and art in order to connect with audiences differently. That's not only because they speak to different audiences, because somebody who's going to pick up a comic is different than somebody that's going to pick up a white paper or read a news article or a peer-reviewed journal article. But they also speak to us differently because they're drawing upon the subjectivity that we see in the arts. And so here we can see how the panels of the borders here, we can see the violence of this particular story moving outside of the panel wall in a way that I think I work on panel borders and national borders. And this is one of the ways in which I set them in dialogue. You can see in this next example, Kate Evans' threads. She uses lace at the corner of all of her comics, and that's sort of integrating a history of lace making in Calais alongside this commentary on the quote unquote Calais jungle, which has much better names. I also find it really fascinating how the technology of migration is integrated into comics and cartooning about migration stories. And so those are sort of the tiers of my research interests in comics. But what I'm here to talk to you about today, oh, and I didn't even start my timer. I did it for both of you and not myself. So if somebody else is going to have to keep me on track. I'm the director of the UBC Comic Studies Cluster, which is a unit on campus that initially I thought we were just going to support comic scholarship. And then so many people asked me if I made comics, I decided, well, maybe I should. Not that I can draw. So the Comic Studies Cluster is a unit on campus that helps people partner. We partner cartoonists with First Nations, with nonprofits, with faculty, with researchers, particularly at BC Children's Hospital right now, to make comics about the things that matter to them. We at the very foundation of this work is this idea that stories and narrative matter. They're seductive, to use some of your language, but they also connect with us differently because stories fundamentally structure our lives. Our gender is a story, our history is a story, our traditions are stories. It doesn't mean these stories aren't true or grounded in reality, but they're all kind of narratives that we circulate throughout society. So drawing upon story is also one of the best ways to change people's opinions on lived experience. When it comes to comics and migration, little thing is tricky. There are many ways in which I frame the importance of turning to comics to tell migration stories. One of which is because we're relating embodied experience. You can't disconnect the data from the bodies or the people that are telling these stories. It helps individualize universal stories. It also turns to cartooning instead of photojournalism, which protects vulnerable individuals that are still on the move. It ensures that their families won't receive any repercussions from them telling their stories. It represents intersectional experience really well. We can't flatten somebody's identity to one thing. You see both race, ethnicity, body size, all at the same time. And so there's no one predominant marker of identity, which I think speaks to the intersectional capacity of comics and cartooning. And then the form itself can relay additional stories, like how I was talking about how panel borders can tell us something in addition to the narratives that are being relayed within the comic frames themselves. How am I doing on time? Nobody's counting. Okay. Well, there we go. We're just going to keep talking. No, I'm just kidding. I promised everyone I'd try to stay to 7 minutes. So there are so many reasons why we can turn to comics. The collaborative nature of comics, I consider it a form of decolonial research practice, and I can go into that. That first picture that you saw is actually from a project that's ongoing with the Homolko First Nation. It's where I started making comics because I was approached by a First Nation that said, can we make a comic? And I was like, I'll figure it out. They're reach new audiences. They're a form of embodied testimony, but also because media representation matters. And I see this time and time again. When the stories of the individuals that are being impacted are relayed through media that they might consume, it's super empowering. But it also helps you meet your knowledge mobilization goals. It helps you speak to diverse audiences. It's also feasible because it takes 3 to 6 months. You're working with one cartoonist. It's not a $10,000 20-minute documentary film. It's $300 a page. And most of the comics that we distribute are 8 to 12 pages. And we work with local cartoonists. And we have a network of Indigenous cartoonists that we draw upon for certain projects if it's a priority for that specific group or individual we're working with. So they're both affordable, they're feasible, and they help those knowledge mobilization goals. But beyond knowledge mobilization and knowledge translation, I do think that making comics is a form of research creation as well. We get new knowledge when we turn something into a comic or a cartoon. We get new knowledge when we see something as its artistic representation. And so that's something I've started to really advocate for. Using comics as a form of arts-based research. And we have a lot of examples of that. And what I want to conclude on, since I have no idea how long I've taken at this point, is how using comics and other forms of arts-based research are so important as AI becomes more present in all of our research modalities and research methodologies. Using art to transmit, translate, and create new information really honors human experience. It keeps the people in the data dissemination. And so for me, turning to comics right now is just so important because we're working with specific individuals, we're telling embodied experience, and we're reaching out to the humanity in our reader. So I'm going to end there, though I do have several other slides, as Maza knows. And I do want to highlight 2 projects that came specifically out of CMS, but we can maybe do that during our Q&A.
Great. Well, I love the work you're doing, and we're part of a collective on comics and trauma at UVic as well, which is an interesting angle as well. So I'm actually going to touch on comics for a moment. I come to this as a traditional journalist working in traditional media organizations, and despite very legitimate critiques one might have about the media landscape and journalists, I do think a lot of journalists are still trying to do really good work on reporting on migration and related issues. And many of them are good at putting in freedom of information requests, doing interviews with government officials, doing accountability, all that. Where we often fail is connecting with the migrant communities for a number of reasons. My parents were refugees. They would never in a million years talk to a journalist for a lot of reasons. First of all, you're a new person. You don't want to make waves. You don't want to put your head up. You're trying to get by. And many migrants come from countries where talking to journalists can be dangerous, could get you killed, could get you arrested. So as journalists, we have a really difficult time getting migrants or immigrants in general to speak with us. So one of the, and as well as many marginalized communities, and I'll get into that in just a moment. So at the Global Reporting Center, one of the things we try to do is look at problems within journalism practice and look at solutions. And we're very fortunate to get significant support from the Peter Wall Institute of Advanced Studies, which sadly is gone now. But we went to them with this problem and said, can you help us support us to experiment with solutions? And they did. And really, the Global Reporting Center sort of grew out of support from the Peter Wall Institute a decade ago. And what we developed is sort of a new form of journalism that we call empowerment journalism. And it's a way of embracing and partnering with marginalized communities broadly, including migrant communities, and finding ways of essentially breaking the rules of journalism. In a traditional journalism context, you wouldn't go to a story source and say, I want to give you the last word on this story, right? You wouldn't say, I'll let you do final cut on it. Maybe you can even imagine saying to them, you can actually own this story. I'm going to facilitate this, but you as a story subject will own this story. These are fireable offenses at the New York Times and 60 Minutes and all the places that I've worked in the past. For understandable reason. You wouldn't want to do that with Donald Trump, right? Because if you give Donald Trump last word on his stories, he's going to be the greatest in every story. So there are reasons that you draw these lines, but there are also reasons that you might want to break those rules and change it. So a number of years ago, we were looking at a project about the rise of xenophobia in Europe. And we went to a number of these different marginalized communities and ones that normally wouldn't probably speak to outsiders. But more importantly, what we learned from it was we were able to find these nuanced stories that we never would have surfaced if we had come in as outsiders, if we had sort of parachuted in and tried to come in sort of quote unquote objectively and report on whatever we could glean and then take these stories out of those communities and leave. I'll give a couple examples. Alexander Zagrev, who's a prominent graphic novelist in Serbia, we partnered with him and we asked him what he wanted to talk about. And he said, I want to talk about anti-Semitism in Serbia. And we're like, okay, I didn't even know there was anti-Semitism. There's no Jews in Serbia. How can you have anti-Semitism? And he said, that's exactly the point. There are no Jews. All the Jews were wiped out during the Holocaust. And yet I go to football matches and there's visible anti-Semitism. And I'm really curious in exploring that. And he did that through this graphic novel series he did, which was just brilliant. And he animated it and turned it into a film for us. Esme Ragapovich, who called herself the Queen of the Gypsies, a prominent Roma musician and cultural leader in Macedonia, we partnered with her and we said, well, what story would you like to tell? And she said, I want to talk about how great it is for Roma in Europe. We're like, really? That's not what I heard, but okay. And I used to live in Europe and I didn't really see that. And she goes, no, but Macedonia is a special scenario. And she said, what's interesting is I want to take a solutions lens to this because in Macedonia, she worked with Tito back when Tito was in power. And basically a number of Roma leaders worked with Tito to get rights in a way that many other parts of Europe were not affording to Roma people. And so today, a lot of doctors and lawyers and teachers are people of the Roma communities, and they're accepted in society in a way that in many other parts of Europe, they're not. So she made this documentary with us that, again, she was the author of, she was the voice of, she was the owner of, and it really embraced this, the idea that if you give people the opportunity, they can be obviously equal with anybody else in society, but so she really highlighted the problems in the rest of Europe in contrast to what she had experienced and helped essentially establish in Macedonia. So there are many examples I can give. So there's one other amazing example that came out of that project that I loved, which was a group of Turkish journalists in Germany wanted to work with us. And they said, we want to invite you and we want to make a documentary about this event we host. Like, what's this event? Basically, they have Turkish names and sometimes kind of Muslim-sounding names, and so they get all of this hate mail. And so they said, what we do is we get together every month in a cafe, and instead of doing a poetry slam, we do a hate mail slam. So they invite people out from the community, and they just get up and they read the hate mail, and they embrace it, and they own it, and they basically denature that hate and turn it into an entertainment event. And it was none of those projects and many others I can cite would have ever happened if we had sort of parachuted in. We never would have been able to get the insights to those communities, we never would have been able to get access. There's so much suspicion of journalists, rightly so, because we often are ones who come from the outside. Duncan McHugh, who helped create did create the Reporting in Indigenous Communities program at UBC, amazing journalist and scholar, now sadly Carlson, but still connected with us. He often talks about the difference between storytelling and story taking. He's an Indigenous journalist, and he said, Indigenous communities are so used to everything being taken, our people being taken, our totem poles being taken, everything being taken. And journalists do the same thing. We come in, get your little story, and we leave. He's like, don't do that. Partner with us. And he and Catherine Gretzinger, who's here, helped develop this course where they worked in partnership with community to create these stories in a way that is not typical of how journalists practice. So I could talk more about this later. I want us to get on to questions, but I will make one little plug. We're putting in a SSHRC partnership grant at the Global Reporting Center on empowerment journalism. So if anyone's interested in this approach, we want to work with scholars across a wide range. Come email me.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. And thank you to all of you for just grounding us in the work that you are doing. And now that we have a bit of context setting in terms of your mode of storytelling, perhaps we'll start more broadly, and Peter sort of plugged us into it already. Where have you seen the creative or narrative approaches that you are taking on, or something that traditional academic output simply couldn't, and you came in with your mode? Where have you seen that actually work and applied?
So I guess it's an unexpected, true success of partnering and doing collaborative co-creation when it comes to comics. And this isn't in dialogue with some of them with migration studies themes that we're talking about today, though you invited us to always be thinking about decolonial education and decolonial issues when you did your land acknowledgement. So this project is one that started between, it's led by Chadis Leo, who is a Homolko journalist, and we partnered with Education Without Borders to turn to recordings with elders that were made in the 90s to tell stories of traditional knowledge through Indigenous cartoonists. And we partnered on this project, and we launched, and they own all the rights to it. They do the distribution. I just facilitate these projects. But one thing that was and it's for the language revitalization program. So there is Indigenous language throughout the story and a visual glossary at the end. But it was not only so warmly received by the community because of this, how media really matters. The sale of these comics to libraries, school boards, other public education settings was so immense that they were able to fund their traditional canoe journey. So they made $7,000 in that first year, put it all towards their annual canoe trip that they do with two of their sister nations. And they were so excited about it, we're now making a comic about that trip. So the impact is that it is truly felt by our partners, that it's financial sometimes. It's also, there's been a number of news stories about it. It's advanced Chadis's own career. It has advanced the careers of many of the cartoonists who I continue to part with. So the impact is not what we consider, is not what we write into our grant applications. But it feels so much more meaningful because it's community engaged and in dialogue with our partners' goals and communication needs. So.
Thanks, Biz. Maybe I'll go to the more tailored question that speak to some of your niche areas, and I can start with you, Geraldine. In your book, Migration and Performance, you discuss how research-based play changed meaning as it traveled across different contexts. In your case, it was from Vancouver to Manila to Berlin. So looking back, what did those shifts teach you about the limits of scholars' control over how some of these migration stories are actually interpreted?
Thank you. I think rather than a concern about control over the interpretation. I've been very interested in kind of both with theater, you kind of lose control in a very principled way. And so rather than controlling the narrative, that question made me think on the benefits of losing control in a way and the things I've learned as the play travels. So learned different things in different contexts. But so one example, when the script reading was done in Whitehorse, an Indigenous storyteller was in the audience, and she stood up afterwards and said, you know, different, our family separation stories are different, but this resonates with me. And so what developed out of that was a new play, a collaboration between this Tlingit storyteller and Filipino. And so it developed a play that we call Klinkapino Bingo, took place in the Bingo Hall in Whitehorse the following year. But then different things came up when we took the play to the Philippines. The first time we took it, we were, a dramaturgy student said, this is a white man's play for white man's problems, which was interesting because it came out of collaboration with the Philippine Women's Center. And so unpacking that has been a really important kind of process. So the first was, it was in English. The second of all, it was in a beautiful theater with a very rich history in terms of radical politics in the Philippines, the Peta Theater Center. But it was accessible to a middle-class audience. And so we were invited from that performance by Migrante International to bring it back and take it to a migrant serving community. And that process really, we just learned so much about how the whiteness was baked into that, and the Canadian, like that was baked into that play. It wasn't just the English, it was, it came down to even the form, the theatrical form. So I would say it's the loss of control of narrative that for me has been really important. Yeah.
Kamal, I'll head over to you. So with Canadian media and political debates, they often imply the distinctions between the desirable migrants and those who are framed as burdens or problems. Now, based on your writing on race and belonging, how do these hierarchies operate in Canada today? And what are some of those narrative strategies that can disrupt them without simply replacing one moral hierarchy over the other?
Sure. I think you're absolutely right in thinking that in the general sort of Canadian imagination, there are two groups of immigrants, the deserving and the undeserving. The deserving ones are people like me who came to Canada after finishing their PhD and are perceived to be either job creators or independent, well-educated. In fact, when I was doing my immigration papers, it's like, you're exactly what we need in Canada. However, something that I've explored to some depth in my journalism is that the entire Canadian economy is predicated on the exploitation of migrant workers or migrant guest temporary foreign workers. And the work that I do, or the work that other journalists do in that field, is trying to kind of really question these assumptions that some Canadians have. I don't think we will. I mean, if you look at the kind of labor-intensive and largely not reasonably rewarded work, whether you're working at a supermarket checkout, you're working in the field. I'm thinking of farm workers. I think if you were to pay local population fair wages, none of these economic systems will survive. So it is something I try to do in my work, and I love it when my students do the same, is that try to puncture that assumption that the only immigrants who bring economic benefits to Canada are the ones who are coming through the skills migration route. And the other side of it briefly is that, you know, that other group is full of people with dreams and hopes and lives and people they've left behind. All you see them is, you only see their work. You don't see the full complexity of life, which reminds me of a saying that was specifically said in description of Turkish migrants in Germany, is that we wanted workers, we got people, which is why the Turkish immigration in Germany became much more complex.
Thanks, Kamal. Bez, I'll turn to you because you've already touched on how some of the Indigenous collaborations you've worked at have been successful. Now, when communicating migration through visual storytelling, how are you negotiating questions of authorship, authority, and responsibility, especially given the risk of well-intentioned scholarship reproducing colonial dynamics?
So the collaborative nature and the co-creative nature and the participatory action research approach to creating comics is grounded in a project that I'm currently on. It's a partnership grant. It's called, Survivor-Centered Visual Storytelling, and it's all about working with survivors of genocide and human rights atrocity and partnering them with cartoonists to co-create stories together that they have absolute rights on, that they can also pull from the project at any point before it's actually been released. And so a lot of the methodologies that I draw upon were developed in dialogue with the pilot project, which was on with a series of Holocaust survivors. And I think it's so important to have, you can't just sort of step into a space where like, let's make a comic, and you don't really understand the implications of that and don't know how to articulate it. For example, there is a graphic novelist that I teach in my class that I invited into class to speak about her work in autobiography. And she believes that doing this kind of visual work is fundamentally unethical because of the way that you're always presenting other people, that autobiography at the outset is always unethical to a certain degree. So there always needs to be an acknowledgement of that, like to sort of like sit with the ways in which there's always going to be an impact that is unanticipated. But taking the goals of the partners that you're working with at the very foundation, at the core of that work, to try to honor those goals, and then just do your best, learn from all your mistakes, pivot, make amends, try again, get more funding, do it again. I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but it's always knowing, and that's I'm a settler scholar, so, and when I work a lot in Indigenous communities, I know that at every turn I say something a little bit wrong, and not letting that defeat me, because I know that I want to do the good work, and that requires just a lot of learning and missteps in the process.
Thanks, Bez. Peter, I'll turn to you, leaning on your journalism background. We know in Canada, migration issues tend to pop up the moments of crisis, whether we're looking at irregular border crossings, labor shortages, or even housing pressure. Then they quickly disappear from the news cycle. From your experience in leading those long-form investigations, what does it take to keep migration stories alive long enough to actually challenge some of those underlying policies?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's an applicable question beyond migration as well, but I think it's particularly relevant here because you're right. They tend to pop up. I mean, even just think about this campus, right? You know, we deal with issues about international students. Everyone was talking about it for a while, and then it sort of went away. But we're dealing with the fallout of the disappearance of international students on so many levels, and then it's no longer in the news, and as if somehow the public and the policymakers are like, well, that's resolved. Like, no, it's not resolved. Just because you're not talking about it doesn't mean it's resolved. So journalists, I think even in the best of times, journalists have short attention spans. When there was a lot of money and there was a lot of power and all those things, they weren't great about this. But I think these days, with the economic pressures, with the smaller newsrooms, all of those issues, it does make it very difficult. You know, we tend to follow whatever is going on. I think newsrooms have to have a core group of whether they're big newsrooms, small newsrooms, local newsrooms, national, international newsrooms, have to have a core group of people whose job is to stay on stories long term. I mean, I think that's critical because ultimately, if you don't have that, you're going to be, if you only have the firefighters and don't have anybody else who's doing home inspections and checking, making sure houses aren't wired properly and everything, you're just going to constantly be putting out fires and never preventing those fires from happening. So the investigative journalists, the enterprise journalists, the deep dive reporters need to be staying on these stories. And on a kind of an individual level, and what I always tell my students is, if you care about something, find a way to make it happen, and just fight in the newsroom to get those stories out there. And it's incredible because most of the time when you do that, you win. Editors appreciate that. They respect that. They're like, this person's willing to do overtime, spend time doing this. We're not going to pay them extra, and they really care about this. They're going to do this story, and it's going to be good, and it'll have impact. So it's not a great answer, but I'm just asking your question is part of the solution, because I think we need to have a lot more conversations about that and keep these issues in the news, because as you say, they pop up and then they disappear, and we're all left with the fallout.
This is why I love long-form narrative, because of what you said, deep dive, but long-form narrative allows you to just take that story after it disappeared from the headline. Because usually, if you even do a feature for a magazine, it may take up to a year to get it done, or a documentary, or a comic book, or a play. Those long-form narratives keep the story and the people or the issues in people's minds in general.
I'll say just one last thing on this. We get really distracted, as you say, like the Hungarian elections last week. Everyone's, Peter Magyar is great. He defeated Viktor Orban. Everyone's now forgotten that, Kamal referenced eating the dogs and the cats in the US. Peter Magyar, who's as anti-immigrant as Viktor Orban in Hungary, talked about how the Filipino migrants are eating the ducks at the Budapest Zoo. But everyone's forgotten about this, and all of a sudden he's like this hero. So I think it's our job to keep raising these issues.
Thank you. Thank you both. Geraldine, I'll turn to you because you've emphasized collaboration and care as ethical commitments that we make, particularly when you're working with migrant communities, as you did with the Filipino Women's Center. So at a time where universities are increasingly then rewarding visibility and matrix, how do you resist that extractive form of storytelling while still meeting that pressure to scale up public-facing migration research?
I'm in the same mode of resisting this question or turning, and that is, I guess when I read that question, I was thinking, universities have so much money compared to other, so there's a kind of way in which I think we have so many resources here to do interesting things. We've talked about all these grants we can get. That's kind of extraordinary. And so I think this mode of collaboration has been, we've been doing it for a long time. And so I would say that maybe there's a way of, just reorienting that we actually do have these amazing resources to move out into the community. So I would say that that's a priority, and these long-term sustained relationships are the way that our research should be conducted.
So we do want to hear from the audience, and my understanding today is that the questions will be posted through Slido, which AMSSA will put the code up shortly. And whilst you're loading your questions on Slido, which will allow us to moderate them for the panel, perhaps I'll turn to you, Biz, because you touched a bit on this in your presentation. Your research shows that comics can actually represent, forced migration and historical violence without flattening that complexity. Now, what do comics allow audiences to feel or grasp that you feel that migration-based text scholarship can often then struggle to convey? And you touched a bit on this in one of your slides.
Thank you for that question. So comics can convey the emotional spectrum that the visual arts can writ large. And it's that emotional dimension that we really lose in the scholarship, the humanity at the foundation of all the stats and statistics, and the embodied stories that we lose when we turn to just textual media. There's a bunch of stuff that I think comics do so well, though, because when you read a comic, you're trained to be anticipating text and image side by side. And so comics in particular can capture not only the internal dimensions, like expressionist painting can like express the interiority of a subject externally. So you can kind of visualize the way that somebody is emotionally impacted by a situation. But what I love is that comics represent silence well. They represent anxiety. They represent claustrophobia. They represent depression. With the silence thing, like if you're trained to expect words and image side by side as you're moving through a comics page or a series of panels, and then the language is absent, it feels quite profound. And I can't really, there are not very many media. I mean, cinematically, we also experience silence differently, but comics are not immersive like cinema. You're not supposed to just sit there and be a passive reader. You engage in the process of meaning making. You are the individual reading the book that is stitching the story together one panel at a time. We talk about how comics are, in fact, time laid out in space. And without the reader there is no story. And those connections are very subjective and very individual versus a cinematic experience. You sit back, let the movie proceed, and you just sort of passively internalize it. I think comics hit you differently because of the agency in the reader in making sense of those images. And they serve the expression of mental health really well. There's a genre called graphic medicine that is particularly oriented to telling stories of patient experience, caregiver experience, and the medical sciences more broadly. And so mental health and physical well-being, chronic pain, anxiety, depression, all of these elements of what it means to be human in a crisis are much better captured when we turn to visual modalities.
Thanks, Biz. Peter, I'll turn to you before I head to Slido, because this is something you touched on in your opening remarks. We know that for many reasons, for some migrant communities, whether it's we avoid visibility, whether it's fear of deportation, employer retaliation, loss of status, it goes on. What's the role that you think that we can play in mitigating that harm rather than amplifying it? And how do you tell these stories responsibly without increasing the risk for these migrants?
Yeah, no, it's an important question too. I mean, I touched on empowerment journalism, which is sort of the extreme end of it, but I think that not everything is right for that particular, approach. I think like with any vulnerable story subject, I hate to use the word story subject because then it sort of kind of simplifies and objectifies them, but I mean, that's the reality of how I think a lot of journalists think about it is you have to spend the time. And it is really, you can't just show up. I mean, I'm hesitant to even quote this, but like there's a book that was written about foreign correspondence that highlighted the cold approach that foreign correspondents often take in war zones. And it was in a refugee camp where this British journalist stood up and said, "Has anybody here been raped?" And just yelled this out as if like that there was this transactional kind of quality to what he was doing. And that's the worst case scenario, obviously. But you want to be able to spend the time, you want to be able to earn the trust, and really importantly, stay in touch after the project is done. This is, to me, such an important part of it because, if you drop the person as soon as your story's been published, that you've just underscored all the fears that people have, and you've screwed it up for other journalists in the future, right? So staying in touch with people, going back to them, telling them maybe they didn't end up in your story, but it was a valuable connection. All those little things. I mean, I think something we talk about a lot at our school is trying to train students to be ethical on so many levels and think about the long-term impact of what we do on the field itself.
Thanks, Peter. The question that I have, I'll now be going through the questions that are on Slido. First question I see here is, they see a great potential in more collaboration with local settlement sector organizations to share some of the work you've been talking about and the stories with such a bigger audience. Would you tend to agree with that? Yeah? I think they do. Awesome. The next question is, how do you prevent conflicts of interest as a journalist when working very closely, often befriending your sources? And I think, Kamal, you touched about this.
Well, first of all, I would probably sometimes question the expression conflict of interest, because if I'm writing, one of my stories was about Yemeni refugees in Malaysia. I am originally from Yemen. There's no conflict of interest in me writing about that community. I've got skin in the game in many ways. If you are writing about subjects, I tend to only write about things that I'm invested in emotionally and sometimes that reflect my reality. I don't necessarily see it as a conflict of interest. I bring in insight, I bring in lived in experience. However, I would say in writing about domestic workers or construction workers, is that we may share the same skin color and we come from sort of the global South. But I carry with me the privilege of being an academic. I carry with me the privilege of having been a journalist at a national paper, and I'm constantly aware of the power imbalance in those relationships. And instead of conflict of interest, what I try to focus on is the do no harm, something, again, that we emphasize in the school. For example, if someone feels vulnerable but only wants to share their first name or just my initial, I don't push back on that. That's their call. That's their judgment call. So maybe I just would kind of tweak the word conflict of interest. It's just to encompass a number of things. And one of them is that you, as a storyteller, as a journalist, that you have so much power. I mean, ultimately, I've noticed that a lot of my colleagues on the panel here do a lot of collaborative work. I don't necessarily identify as someone who does collaborative work. Ultimately, the direction of the narrative and the direction of how a story is told rests with me.
Thanks, Kamal. This one is directed specifically to Peter and Geraldine. What has been a philosophy and protocol overcoming language barriers when you're gathering stories from participants or those you are interviewing?
I could start because I'm close. Let me say one other thing on what Kamal said, which is a great answer. I sort of have a kind of a cheap magic bullet for this conflict of interest thing, which is transparency. So, Kamal, if he was reporting on Yemenis in Singapore and the audience doesn't know that he's Yemeni, there might be a conflict of interest. Not a conflict of interest, but sort of it's valuable for the reader to know that. Not because they're going to be suspicious about it, but they'll understand that the writer is coming with a nuance and an understanding and a perspective. So to me, so much of it comes down to transparency. In terms of language, it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. Even not just, obviously, if you don't speak the language, it's hard to talk to somebody. So you can have a translator or an interpreter, and those are two different things, right? And you're probably not going to have a simultaneous translation. I've been a simultaneous translator. It's very hard to do. So to have the simultaneous translation is almost impossible, although we have done that in our journalism work. So you'll often have an interpreter who's essentially telling you roughly what has been said. And there's a great example from a class I taught several years ago at the journalism school where our students went to Thailand, and they actually had someone from this community who is the interpreter, who was working with these shrimp farmers, and they were. So I won't bore you with all the details of it, but basically, this interpreter was completely misinterpreting what the farmers are saying. to the opposite, I mean, essentially opposite. If the farmers were saying, we hate the regulations in this country, she was saying like, they really love the regulations in this country. But nobody spoke Thai in our team. So we came back and translated and we're like, wait a minute, that's not at all what the person was saying. So, I mean, there's a lot of harm there. Obviously, if you don't catch it, it's really bad. But it's also in the field, you want to know what's going on and you want to be able to respond. So having a good interpreter at the beginning is really good. Doing a secondary translation is really important. And then also understanding the cultural aspects of it. I'll give it one other quick example, and I want to go give it to Jerry. But I did an interview with Mutal Sadr, the Shiite insurgency leader, years ago when the war in Iraq started. And he used the word shaitan. And we actually had a simultaneous interpreter, but we had someone who was not from a different country, and Arabic in different countries is very different, as some of you know. And so the translator interpreted shaitan as snake instead of devil. And so Bob Simon, who I was working with, repeated the word. And so we had on camera him using the word that was wrong. And it causes so much trouble, right? Because if you get the word wrong because of cultural reasons, understanding that their language is not, even just between Canada and the US, and certainly Canada, US, and the UK, words are used differently. So I think that's really important.
So because I worked with the Philippine Women's Center and then Migrante International, there was always, very fluent speaking Tagalog speakers. So people have to tell their stories in their own language, right? So the stories that were in Tagalog or Taglish, and sometimes I'm kind of out of it, and that's fine because I am kind of out of it. And then they'd be translated in Manila. The second time we went with the play to work with Migrante International there, I knew enough to figure out that the director we were working with there was not using our script at all, and that was so. We were working with a person that was teaching at the University of Philippine Diliman and then came to do a PhD here. And so Vanessa was sort of working as an interpreter there. So, and we ended up, that's where we turned to the research creation because we realized we need to do research there, that there was a refusal to use the script, which is really interesting. So I would say stories need to be told in the language that's felt. And so Taglish, Tagalog, and then translation by the Philippine Women's Center, by the organizations I'm working with, not by someone else.
Thank you. The next question we have is that there are many anti-immigrant comments circulating right now, and immigrants, unfortunately, then become the scapegoats of many issues that are being faced. What strategies would you recommend to counter them?
Sorry, that immigrants are the subject of, I'll say this, and I said it in another context, is that if you are coming from sort of centrist and center-left, you have to learn how narrative works. You have to learn how to adapt narrative. Again, as I said in my introductory remarks, is that what gives sort of right-wing and fascist groups the advantage in the cultural moment is that they understood that the effect of this simple story. And I think we as academics and people who are, we're hosted by the Center for Migration Studies, who clearly have a vested interest in presenting a fair and accurate picture of migration globally. We just have to learn how to tell stories better and more effectively. And sometimes that could be just more like shorter and more direct. So less jargon, in other words.
Graphic novels.
That's great.
I answered to everything, so I didn't say it. Or a board game. That's my idea.
Awesome. How can academics help tell simple but accurate stories? That's a bit of a conundrum there. That not only mobilize knowledge, but also mobilize people and social movements for good change.
Collectives and journalism.
I would just add, I think experimenting with different modes of storytelling, when we were creating the script for Nanai, we were working with a dramaturg, and at one point she just said, if you want to use all those words, like write an article. And so, yeah, so fewer words, but well chosen.
And I think moving into more media, not just comics, but other popular media that is the kind of ways in which stories are being disseminated today. Understanding like what makes an Instagram reel interesting to the public, knowing how to step into those spaces and like fit in a way where you can tell informed stories. Instead of masquerading as if you can tell informed stories, which is what a lot of influencers are doing, or all of these different categories of information dissemination that are connecting more effectively with youth. And I think we as academics need to recognize how important it is to be teaching popular media and media literacy, taking journalism courses. I also think the humanities are a solution to a lot of the problems we're facing today, that like really in the humanities, you work so much with stories that you develop a capacity to recognize some of these strategies when you're being manipulated. So we need to break down the silos of higher education and talk across disciplines and talk across media better.
And I would just add one thing, that even within my practice of nonfiction, I have, in the last 5 years, discovered audio storytelling and audio documentaries. I'm here in the company of the queen of audio documentaries, Catherine over there, and how much more people actually listen to that than read my books. So it has been a real, and it's been a transition because, you know, I'm used to writing in paragraphs and long form, and writing for the ear is something completely different.
To Peter and Kamal, whose knowledge is considered important in migration narratives?
The boss is throwing me under the bus. Whose knowledge? I mean, I think you need a diversity of knowledge. I mean, I think if you only go to the migrants, you're going to get one side of the story, obviously an important part of the story, but it's going to be, you know, one lens on it. I think it's important to talk to community. It's important to talk to policymakers, and in the process, hold people accountable, everybody accountable. I mean, that's, at least from the journalism standpoint, that's the point of what we're trying to do, is not just sort of facilitate anyone to say whatever they want, but really fact check and be rigorous. So I would say, you know, you need to have all of those voices.
Yeah, no, that's.
Kamal said what you said. Could this type of research go beyond the study of just the marginalized and also start to look at the marginalizer to better understand causes and not only the impacts?
We drafted the part of our script was the government, the representative of immigration. That was so much fun to write. But yeah, so I think definitely we have to write in.
And I also think that it's important to model that. So if we're, as a settler scholar who benefits from some of these systems that oppress others, modeling that reflection in a way that feels substantive and not superficial, I think is really important to help facilitate wider critique of the systems that are doing the oppressing.
And I'm just going to add one more thing, sorry, because for my work, I'm going to focus on the marginalized for now, because the ones doing the marginalizations have access to narrative and network and commissioning stories. So I'm not doing their battles for them. They can do their own.
Well, let me just push back on that. Because, you know, the marginalizers, for lack of a better term, do have their microphones, but they tend to control it themselves. And then they you get the loudest voices, you get the most extreme voices. In the Strangers at Home project I mentioned earlier about xenophobia, several stories we did actually were about the marginalized. One of my favorite ones was a journalist in Italy wanted to, he was not sympathetic to the fascists at all, but he's like, the Italian right is misunderstood, and it'd be interesting to have a story by someone from Casa Pound. It's this emerging, right-wing political organization. And this guy was actually really thoughtful. Didn't agree with him, obviously, but he was like, look, I have nothing against migrants, but like, here's my aunt, here's my uncle, here's my grandmother. They're all, white Italians, and they can't feed themselves, and people have come in and taken these jobs. So just understanding their perspectives brought a nuance. And I think that's important. I think it's important for us to treat these stories with respect so that we can understand them, because the reality is the reality, right? And so understanding where those nativist tendencies come from, I think, is important.
Thanks, Peter. What would you recommend to scholars who are interested in creatively oriented approaches, such as the ones you've taken, but are reluctant because they've not been formally trained in this way?
Collaborate. Yeah, partnership. Yeah.
Good. I love that. Straight answer.
Yeah, not just with academics that have experience with it, but with the communities that circulate in those like cultural forums. Partnering with cartoonists, partnering with playwrights, partnering with nonprofits that are interested in partnering with playwrights and cartoonists, etc. Yeah, partnership collaboration, I just think, is the solution to a lot of things, and comics.
And talk to your graduate program director and ask them to do these knowledge mobilization courses as part of your graduate training. I think that is essential.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So as we close today, I'll invite you to maybe offer some closing reflections. What's one thing, we have a large audience today that has been very interactive. What's one thing you'd want them to carry with them when it comes to communicating migration for impact? Maybe I'll start with you, Peter. You sit next to me.
We're talking a lot about mobilization of knowledge and reaching to the public. The work that some of you I know personally, some of you I just know through your work, the work that you do here is really important. It's deep. It's often for a very specific audience, but it advances knowledge. So obviously, you're not going to stop doing it, but don't stop doing it, because it's critically important. But if we can bring that work out into the world better and appreciate the importance of that, it'll help. I mean, I do think it actually helps us on a scholarly level, because it helps justify the scholarly work that we do, and it can bring that work out and have some real impact. And it goes back to what everyone else was saying, partnering. Don't think you can do it by yourself, right? If you're the expert in one area, and don't necessarily just try to. I've dealt with a number of scholars who are like, well, I'm just going to do a podcast, and I'm just going to interview a scholar for 4 hours about their scholarly work. I was like, that's not really a podcast. So maybe we can help you.
I'll go back to my theme today, is that understand narrative, how narrative works, understands the not necessarily the pros and cons, but what is at risk in narrative, and what are the rewards of narrative.
I think that I'd continue to advocate for arts-based research as a methodology that everyone should develop competencies in. And so if you're a graduate student working on your dissertation, try to find other modalities for sharing that information as a chapter, as an output, and advocating for that kind of training, not just arts as knowledge mobilization, but arts as research practice. Being mindful of how the arts are going to continue to be important even as AI advances to take over other kinds of research practices.
I think I'd come back to that comment by the dramaturge. If you want to, use all those words, write an academic article. That brought me back to really loving academic writing as well. So maybe this sort of echoes what Peter said, that research, that really conventional research, is so important. And and that, you know, and so to recognize the kind of professionalism of the cartoonist or in our case, theater professionals, and see yourselves as actually bringing quite different things to the partnership. I think that's valuable. So I think there is a little bit of just do what you do well in partnership with other people. I would advocate that.
And on a final note, if you're not already publishing in the conversation, which for those of you that don't know is only academics can publish in the conversation. It's an online journal, but it disseminates widely. They help you make it sound okay for people that aren't academics. But really, I think publishing in the conversation does have an impact to get your research to other people's inboxes and browser windows, because it does change the avenues, and it's picked up by all these like local newsletters and newspapers to be very specific in a region while drawing from UBC research and beyond.
I have to say the conversation is out of our school, from the School of Journalism, Writing and Media. Professors, my colleagues, Mary Lynn Young and Alfred Hermida.
Thank you. Thank you all so much just for your honesty, the work you are doing, and even just your willingness to participate today and be part of this panel. We're so grateful. And thank you to everyone for joining us today and being part of it through Slido as well to keep it interactive. I'll give it back to Lisa, who's going to guide us to the next part of the program.